What if the most loved woman in the world was also the loneliest? What if behind the flashing cameras and royal smiles, there was a young girl silently asking for help? Millions believed they knew her story, but the truth was far more fragile and far more human. Before she became the shining princess of hearts, she was simply Diana, shy, uncertain, and deeply sensitive to the world around her. And what happened in her early years would quietly shape every choice she later made, because long before the palace doors opened, something inside her was already breaking, and no one, not even Diana herself, fully understood why. The Lonely Crown. Long before the world knew the name Diana Spencer, she was just a quiet little girl growing up in the English countryside. She was born on July 1st, 1961, into the noble Spencer family, a family with deep connections to the British royal circle. From the outside, her life looked comfortable, even privileged. The Spencer home was large, beautiful, and full of history. But inside that grand house, young Diana often felt something very different. She felt invisible. Her parents, John Spencer and Frances Shand Kidd, had a difficult marriage. Arguments were not rare. Cold silences sometimes filled the rooms. Diana was still very young when she began to notice the tension, though she could not fully understand it. Children are very sensitive to emotional storms, even the quiet ones. When Diana was only 7 years old, the storm finally broke. Her parents divorced, a painful and public separation that left deep marks on her heart. She stayed with her father while her mother moved away. For a sensitive child who already feared being forgotten, this felt like abandonment. Years later, people would say that this moment planted the first seed of the loneliness that would follow her for the rest of her life. At school, Diana was not known as the smartest student. She sometimes struggled with academic work, but what she lacked in grades, she made up for in something much more powerful: emotional warmth. Teachers noticed it. Friends felt it. She had a natural ability to notice when someone was sad, left out, or hurting. Even as a young girl, Diana did something unusual. She cared deeply. While other children chased attention, Diana often stood quietly on the side, watching, feeling, absorbing the emotions of everyone around her. She loved music. She loved dancing. And more than anything, she loved making people feel seen. But inside her own heart, the old fear remained. What if no one truly saw her? As she grew older, Diana attended several boarding schools. Life there was not always easy. She sometimes felt insecure. She sometimes doubted herself. She was tall, a little shy, and often unsure where she truly belonged. But something important was slowly forming inside her, a deep empathy that would later touch millions of lives. By her late teens, Diana was no longer the quiet child hiding in the background. She was still shy, yes, but she was also warm, kind, and quietly magnetic. People felt comfortable around her. They trusted her quickly, even when they had just met. And soon, someone very important would notice her too. In 1977, when Diana was just 16 years old, she briefly met Charles III, then known as Prince Charles. At the time, he was actually interested in her older sister. No one, not the royal family, not the public, and certainly not young Diana, could imagine how deeply their lives would later become connected. But fate was already moving quietly in the background. After finishing school, Diana moved to London and began living a surprisingly normal life for someone from an aristocratic family. She shared an apartment with friends. She worked simple jobs. For a short time, she even worked as a kindergarten assistant. And this is where something beautiful happened. Children loved her immediately. She knelt down to their level. She listened to them carefully. She laughed easily with them. There was no royal distance, no cold formality, only warmth. Even then, people who watched her closely felt there was something special about this young woman, something genuine, something rare. But while Diana was building her quiet life in London, powerful eyes inside British royal family were beginning to notice her more seriously. Prince Charles, now under growing pressure to find a suitable bride, started seeing Diana again. This time, everything felt different. She was young. She was beautiful in a natural, gentle way. She came from the right noble background, and most importantly, she seemed pure and kind in a way the public would adore. But what almost no one asked was the most important question of all. Was she ready for the storm that was coming? Because behind the palace walls, royal life was not a fairy tale. It was a world of pressure, rules, cold expectations, and constant public attention. A world that could lift you to the sky and quietly break your heart at the same time. And very soon, Diana Spencer was about to step directly into that world, without fully knowing the cost. As the press cameras slowly began to turn toward her, and as Prince Charles's interest became more serious, Diana stood on the edge of a life that would make her the most famous woman on earth. But late at night, in the quiet of her small London apartment, she sometimes felt a strange, heavy feeling she could not explain. A feeling that whispered, something big was coming, and it would change everything. When the world started watching. By the time Diana Spencer was 19, her quiet London life was beginning to change in ways she could not fully control. What had once been simple, working with children, sharing laughs with friends, walking through the city almost unnoticed, was slowly slipping away because Charles III was now paying very close attention to her. At first, their renewed meetings seemed gentle and almost innocent. Prince Charles was older, confident, and already one of the most watched men in the world. Diana, in contrast, was still shy, still emotionally tender, and still learning who she really was. But the British public was already hungry for a royal love story. And the moment whispers of their relationship reached the press, everything changed. Photographers began waiting outside her apartment. Reporters started asking questions. Newspapers printed her name more and more often. Diana had lived most of her life in relative privacy, but now the spotlight was slowly, quietly locking onto her. At first, part of her felt excited. It was new. It was flattering. It almost felt like stepping into a dream. But another part of her, the quiet, sensitive part that had been shaped by childhood loneliness, felt something else. Pressure. The dates with Charles became more serious. Their meetings were no longer just polite visits. There were dinners, private conversations, long weekends at royal residences. Each time, Diana tried her best to appear calm and graceful, even when inside she felt unsure of every step. Because the truth was simple. She was falling into a world she did not fully understand. Inside the British royal family, expectations were already forming around her. Courtiers observed her carefully. The press studied every photo. The public began to imagine her in a role she had never planned for herself: future princess, future wife, future symbol. The speed of it all was dizzying. Friends noticed the change first. Diana, who once laughed easily and moved freely through London, was becoming more careful, more watchful, sometimes quieter than usual. She rarely complained. That was not her nature. But the pressure was beginning to settle on her shoulders like an invisible weight. Still, when she was with Charles, she tried to believe in the possibility of something real. There were moments, soft, warm moments, when he seemed kind and attentive. Moments when the fairy tale almost felt possible. And Diana, with her naturally hopeful heart, wanted very much to believe in those moments. But there were also small signals, easy to miss, but deeply important. Sometimes Charles seemed distant, sometimes distracted, sometimes emotionally somewhere else. Diana noticed more than people realized. She was highly sensitive to emotional shifts, always had been. Even as she smiled for cameras and spoke politely during royal gatherings, a quiet question had begun to form in the back of her mind. Was she truly seen, or simply chosen? By early 1981, the pressure around their relationship had reached a new level. The media attention was no longer occasional, it was constant. Every public appearance created headlines. Every photograph was analyzed. Every small gesture between them became national news. And Diana was only 19. One evening, after another exhausting day of attention and speculation, she sat alone, replaying everything in her mind: the excitement, the expectations, the strange emotional distance she sometimes felt from Charles. For the first time, a fragile doubt moved through her heart. What if this story was not as simple as everyone believed? But by then, events were already moving too fast to easily stop. Because very soon, the world would hear an announcement that would change Diana Spencer's life forever. The engagement that changed everything. The pressure had been building for weeks, but when the moment finally came, it still felt unreal to Diana Spencer. In early February 1981, Charles III asked her a question that would echo around the world. He asked her to marry him. For a brief second, time seemed to slow. Diana was only 19 years old. She had known Charles for a relatively short time. Her life had already been moving faster than she could comfortably manage. And yet, standing there in that quiet royal setting, she felt the weight of expectation pressing gently but firmly around her. This was not just a personal moment, it was history in the making. Diana said yes. Very soon, the official announcement was released by the British royal family, and the reaction was immediate and explosive. Newspapers across Britain, and then across the world, filled their front pages with her photograph. Television stations repeated the news again and again. A new royal bride had been chosen, and almost overnight, Diana's private life disappeared completely. When the couple appeared together for their first public interview, millions watched closely. Diana wore a soft blue suit. She looked shy, but radiant. Charles stood beside her, calm and composed, as always. Then the interviewer asked the question everyone was waiting for. "Are you in love?" Diana answered quickly and sincerely. "Yes, of course." But Charles's reply was different. Whatever "in love" means. It was a small moment, a quiet moment, easy to miss in the excitement of the announcement. But for Diana, and later, for many people who would look back on that interview, something about that answer felt strangely cold. Still, the world did not want to see doubt. The world wanted a fairy tale. As the weeks passed, Diana's transformation accelerated. Royal advisors began preparing her for her future role. She received guidance on posture, speech, public behavior, and royal protocol. Her schedule filled quickly. Her freedom grew smaller. Every movement was now observed. Every word was now important. And the media attention became relentless. Photographers followed her everywhere, outside her apartment, outside shops, outside restaurants. Sometimes they shouted questions. Sometimes they pushed too close. Diana, still emotionally young and naturally sensitive, found the constant attention deeply overwhelming, but she rarely showed it in public. Instead, she smiled. She waved. She tried to be exactly what everyone hoped she would be. Inside, however, the emotional pressure was quietly building. There were nights when she lay awake, her mind racing, nights when the future felt less like a dream and more like something vast and unknown. She was stepping into the most famous royal family in the world, and she was doing it very, very young. And there was something else, something she did not fully understand yet. Sometimes, when she was with Charles, she still felt that strange emotional distance. He was polite, he was respectful, but he was not always warm in the way her heart quietly longed for. Diana began trying harder. She wanted to please him. She wanted to be enough. She wanted, more than anything, to be truly loved. As the wedding plans began to take shape, excitement around the world reached a fever pitch. Designers prepared her gowns. Royal planners organized the ceremony. The media called it the wedding of the century. From the outside, Diana Spencer looked like the luckiest young woman on earth. But late at night, when the cameras were gone and the rooms were finally quiet, a soft uncertainty still lived inside her chest. And very soon, That uncertainty was about to grow much louder. The wedding of the century. As the wedding day approached, Diana Spencer's life no longer felt like her own. Every morning brought new lessons, new rules, new expectations. How to walk, how to sit, how to speak in public, how to smile for cameras that never seemed to rest. The young woman who once moved freely through London now lived inside a carefully controlled royal world, and the date was coming fast. July 29th, 1981. The world was already calling it the wedding of the century. The world was already calling it the wedding of the century. Across Britain, excitement was electric. Souvenir shops filled their windows. Newspapers printed special editions. Millions of people made plans to watch the ceremony live. Inside Buckingham Palace, preparations moved with perfect royal precision. From the outside, it looked like a perfect fairy tale. But inside Diana's heart, the emotions were far more complicated. She was only 20 years old. Some days she felt excited, truly excited. There were moments when the dream felt real, moments when she imagined a warm marriage, a meaningful royal life, and the chance to use her natural kindness to help people on a larger scale. But there were also quiet moments of fear, moments when the pressure felt almost too heavy, moments when that small voice inside her whispered questions she did not know how to answer. In the final weeks before the wedding, the media attention reached an overwhelming level. Photographers followed her constantly. Crowds gathered wherever she appeared. Even simple trips outside became carefully managed events. Diana tried to stay strong. She smiled when she needed to smile. She waved when she needed to wave. But the emotional weight was growing. Then the morning of the wedding finally arrived. London woke early. Streets filled with people waving flags. Cameras from around the world prepared to broadcast every second. Inside her room, Diana stood quietly in her famous ivory wedding dress. Beautiful, historic, and heavy in more ways than one. For a moment, she looked at herself in the mirror. Not just as a bride, but as a young woman standing on the edge of a life she could never fully escape from. Soon she entered St. Paul's Cathedral, where more than 3,000 guests waited. An estimated global audience of hundreds of millions watched from their homes. It was one of the most viewed events in modern history. When she walked down the long aisle toward Charles III, the world saw a fairy tale come alive. They saw the dress, they saw the smiles, they saw the future Princess of Wales. What they did not see was the quiet storm already forming inside her. The ceremony was grand, perfectly choreographed, historic. When the vows were spoken and the marriage became official, crowds outside the cathedral erupted in celebration. The royal couple later appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, where their kiss became one of the most famous moments in royal history. The world believed the story had reached its happiest chapter. But inside the palace walls, reality was far more complex, because marriage did not bring Diana the emotional security she had quietly hoped for. In the weeks that followed, the pressure of royal life did not slow down. It intensified. Public duties increased. Media attention grew even stronger. Every outfit she wore became headline news. Every facial expression was analyzed. And slowly, gently, at first, Diana began to feel something she had known once before in childhood: loneliness. Even when surrounded by people, even when standing beside her new husband. There were small moments, easy to miss, when Charles seemed distant again. Polite, yes. Correct, always. But emotionally, somewhere else. Diana tried to ignore the feeling. She tried to focus on her new role. She tried to believe that love would grow stronger with time. But deep inside, that quiet doubt was no longer so quiet, because the fairy tale the world was celebrating was already beginning to crack. The cracks behind the palace walls. After the wedding, the world believed the story was complete. A beautiful young bride had married the future king. The crowds had cheered. The balcony kiss had sealed the fairy tale. Newspapers called it a dream come true. But inside the palace, reality felt very different. Very soon after the honeymoon, Diana began to understand something painful. Royal life was not warm. It was formal, structured, and emotionally distant. Every day followed strict rules. Every public appearance required perfection. There was little space for weakness, confusion, or fear. And Diana felt all three. She was only 20. She was still learning who she was. But now she carried the weight of a nation's expectations. When she walked into a room, hundreds of eyes watched her. When she wore a dress, it became front-page news. When she smiled, people analyzed it. At first, she tried to be strong. She told herself this was part of duty, part of love, part of becoming a princess. But inside her marriage, the emotional distance she had once noticed became harder to ignore. Charles III was kind in public. He performed his role perfectly, but in private, he often seemed distracted, thoughtful, serious, sometimes cold. Diana longed for closeness, for reassurance, for simple affection. Sometimes she felt she was trying to reach someone who was slowly stepping away. There was another quiet shadow over their marriage, a woman from Charles' past. Her name had appeared before, softly, in whispers. Now those whispers were growing louder. Camilla Parker Bowles. At first, Diana did not fully understand the connection. She only felt something was wrong. Phone calls that ended quickly. Emotional absences that had no clear explanation. A sense that part of her husband's heart lived somewhere she could not enter. And because Diana was deeply sensitive, she felt it intensely. Loneliness returned. Not the loneliness of a child in a broken home, but the loneliness of a wife standing next to her husband and still feeling alone. The pressure began to affect her health. She struggled with self-doubt. She questioned her value. She wondered if she was not interesting enough, mature enough, strong enough. In a world that demanded perfection, she began turning her frustration inward. Outwardly, however, something surprising was happening. The public was falling deeply in love with her. When Diana visited hospitals, she did not keep distance. She touched people gently. She bent down to speak to children at eye level. She held hands without fear. She listened, truly listened. Unlike many members of the British royal family, she showed visible emotion. People felt it immediately. She was not just a princess, she was human. And in that humanity, she began to shine brighter than anyone expected. Crowds grew larger wherever she appeared. Cameras followed her constantly. Magazine covers focused more on her than on Charles. Slowly, almost without planning it, Diana became the center of attention. And that created another kind of tension, because inside the palace, popularity could be dangerous. Charles had spent his whole life preparing to be king. He understood duty, tradition, and control. But Diana moved differently. She connected emotionally. She created headlines without trying. She drew love naturally. The world saw a glowing princess. But inside their marriage, the space between them continued to widen. There were arguments now, quiet at first, then sharper. Diana felt misunderstood. Charles felt overshadowed. Both were trapped inside roles they did not fully know how to escape. Still, they continued their public duties. Still, they smiled for photographs. Still, they played the part the world demanded. But at night, when the palace corridors grew silent, Diana sometimes sat alone, thinking about her childhood. She remembered that small girl who feared abandonment, and slowly, painfully, she began to realize something terrifying. She was afraid history was repeating itself. The fairy tale was no longer cracking, it was beginning to fracture. And very soon, a new chapter would begin, one that would bring joy, hope, and even deeper complications. A baby, a smile, and a growing distance. By the summer of 1982, the palace prepared for joyful news. The world was about to welcome the first child of Diana Spencer and Charles III. For the public, it felt like the perfect next chapter of the royal fairy tale. Newspapers filled with hopeful headlines. Crowds gathered outside the hospital. Once again, the spotlight burned bright. When baby Prince William was born, the celebration was enormous. And for a moment, a real, beautiful moment, Diana felt something she had been missing: pure love. Holding her son in her arms changed her in a deep and powerful way. She was no longer just a young princess trying to survive royal life. She was now a mother, and motherhood awakened a fierce emotional strength inside her. But even in this moment of joy, the cracks in her marriage did not disappear. In fact, in some ways, they grew wider. Diana was a deeply hands-on mother. She wanted to hold William herself. She wanted to be present. She wanted to give him the emotional warmth she had often missed in her own childhood. This approach was unusual inside the British royal family, where royal children were often raised with more distance and formal care. The public loved her even more for it. They saw a princess who broke quiet royal traditions, a princess who kissed her baby in public, a princess who looked, for the first time in years, genuinely happy when she was with her child. But inside the palace, the emotional temperature remained cold. Charles continued his royal duties, traveling often and focusing heavily on his work. Diana, still very young and emotionally sensitive, sometimes felt left behind. She needed reassurance. She needed closeness. She needed to feel that her husband truly stood beside her, not just in photographs, but in real life. Too often, that feeling did not come. There were long evenings when Diana sat alone in large palace rooms that suddenly felt far too quiet. The noise of the crowds was gone, the cameras were gone, and in that silence, old insecurities returned. Was she truly loved or simply admired from a distance? Her popularity with the public was now undeniable. Wherever she went, people reached for her. They called her name. They cried when they met her. The media began using a new phrase to describe her growing emotional connection with ordinary people: the people's princess. And while the world's love for Diana grew stronger every month, the emotional space between her and Charles continued to stretch. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. There were more disagreements now, more misunderstandings, more moments when Diana felt she was fighting for emotional oxygen inside a very controlled royal world. Still, she tried to hold everything together, for duty, for the crown, and now, for William. But deep inside, the pressure was building towards something neither she nor the palace could fully control. Because very soon, another major change was coming, one that would bring joy to the public and push the royal marriage even closer to the edge. Joy for the world, silence at home. In 1984, the royal family prepared once again for happy news. Another baby was coming. For the public, it felt like the fairy tale was still alive. The young princess who had captured the world's heart was about to welcome her second child. Crowds grew hopeful again. Newspapers filled with warm predictions. Many people believed this new chapter would strengthen the marriage between Diana Spencer and Charles III. But inside the palace, the emotional reality was far more complicated. When baby Prince Harry was born, the world celebrated loudly. Diana, holding her newborn son, once again felt that deep, protective love that motherhood had awakened in her. With William and Harry, she created the warm, affectionate environment she had always wished for as a child. She hugged them openly. She laughed with them. She insisted on being present in their daily lives in ways that surprised many royal observers. The public adored her even more. To millions of people watching from outside the palace gates, Diana looked like the perfect modern princess, beautiful, caring, and deeply human. But behind closed doors, the emotional distance in her marriage had now become impossible to ignore. Charles remained committed to his royal duties. His schedule was full. His focus was often elsewhere. And although he fulfilled his responsibilities as a father in public, the emotional closeness Diana longed for continued to feel just out of reach. There were moments, small but painful, when she sensed she was facing her struggles alone. By now, Diana was no longer the shy 19-year-old who had entered the royal spotlight. She was learning, watching, understanding the quiet dynamics around her. And slowly, a difficult awareness was forming in her heart. The marriage was not what she had hoped. The loneliness was not temporary. It was becoming part of her daily life. At the same time, something remarkable was happening outside the palace walls. Diana's connection with ordinary people was growing stronger than anyone in the British royal family had expected. When she visited hospitals, patients reached for her hand. When she met children, they ran toward her without fear. When she walked into a room, the atmosphere changed. She made people feel seen. She made people feel safe. And the cameras captured every moment. This rising global love brought Diana comfort, but it also created quiet tension inside the royal household. Because the brighter she shined in public, the more complicated her private world seemed to become. There were more serious conversations now between her and Charles, more emotional misunderstandings, more nights when sleep did not come easily. Still, Diana continued forward, for her sons, for her role, for the millions of people who now looked to her not just as a princess, but as something warmer and more human. Yet deep inside, she could feel the pressure building toward a breaking point. Because very soon, the quiet whispers that had followed her marriage from the beginning were about to become impossible to ignore. The truth no one could hide anymore. By the mid-1980s, the fairy tale was no longer convincing. To the public, Diana Spencer still appeared radiant. She traveled the world. She visited hospitals, schools, and charities. She shook hands without gloves. She hugged children. She sat beside sick patients others were afraid to touch. Her warmth felt real, and people responded with deep love. But inside her marriage, the silence had become heavy. The emotional distance between Diana and Charles III was no longer just a feeling, it was a reality. They lived parallel lives under the same royal roof, public smiles, private tension, and then the whispers grew louder. The name that had once floated quietly in the background now returned with force. Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana had sensed it before, the emotional connection that never fully disappeared. But now she could no longer ignore the signs. Phone calls, private meetings, a closeness that did not belong to the past. For a deeply sensitive person like Diana, this was devastating. She had entered the marriage young, hopeful, and emotionally open. She had tried to adapt, tried to please, tried to become everything she believed was expected of her. But the realization that her husband's heart might still belong elsewhere cut deeply. And this pain did not stay hidden. It affected her health. It affected her confidence. It affected the way she saw herself in the mirror. She began to struggle privately with emotional and physical stress. The pressure of royal life, combined with heartbreak, became overwhelming. Yet something extraordinary happened during this dark period. Instead of closing herself off, Diana slowly began turning her pain into empathy. When she met people who were suffering, the sick, the poor, the forgotten, she did not speak to them as a distant royal figure. She spoke to them as someone who understood loneliness, as someone who knew what it felt like to smile while hurting inside. And the world noticed. Her visits to hospitals treating AIDS patients were especially powerful. At a time when fear and misunderstanding surrounded the disease, Diana chose compassion. She touched hands. She sat close. She showed the world that kindness was stronger than fear. Her influence grew beyond fashion and royal ceremonies. She was becoming a symbol of emotional courage. But inside the palace, tension continued to rise. Arguments between Diana and Charles became more direct, harder to ignore. They were no longer just a mismatched couple struggling privately. They were two powerful public figures living inside a marriage that was slowly falling apart. The media began to sense it. The cameras did not just capture smiles anymore. They searched for signs. A cold glance, a forced expression, a visible distance between them during public events. And Diana, once silent and unsure, was changing. She was beginning to understand her own strength. She was beginning to question the system around her. She was beginning to realize that staying quiet might no longer protect her or her sons, but speaking out would mean something even more dangerous, because if the truth came fully into the light, it would not only shake a marriage, it could shake the monarchy itself. The night she chose to speak. By the early 1990s, the silence was no longer protecting anyone. The marriage between Diana Spencer and Charles III had become a subject of constant public speculation. Books were being written, private conversations were leaking, headlines were sharper now, no longer romantic, no longer gentle. The fairy tale had officially collapsed. In 1992, the couple announced their separation. It was formal, calm, carefully worded. But behind those controlled statements was years of emotional pain. For Diana, the separation was both terrifying and freeing. For the first time, she was no longer trying to save something that had already been broken. But she was also stepping into an uncertain future, one without the safety of illusion. And then came the moment that changed everything. In 1995, Diana agreed to a televised interview with journalist Martin Bashir for the BBC program Panorama. It was a decision that shocked the royal world. No senior royal had ever spoken so openly about private struggles. The monarchy depended on silence, tradition, and emotional distance. But Diana had reached a point where silence felt heavier than truth. On the night of the interview, millions watched. She did not appear angry. She did not appear dramatic. She appeared calm, but firm. And then she said the sentence that would echo around the world. There were 3 of us in this marriage. With those words, the unspoken became undeniable. The connection between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles was no longer a rumor. It was a public truth. But Diana did more than speak about betrayal. She spoke about loneliness, about mental health, about feeling isolated inside the British royal family, about losing herself. For many viewers, it was the first time they saw not a princess, but a woman fighting to be heard. Public reaction was powerful and divided. Some admired her courage. Others believed she had crossed a line by breaking royal silence. Inside the palace, the consequences were immediate. The marriage could not continue. In 1996, the divorce was finalized. Diana lost the title, Her Royal Highness, but she remained Princess of Wales. She kept her apartment at Kensington Palace. Most importantly, she kept her role as mother to William and Harry. Now, for the first time since she was 19, Diana stood alone. No husband beside her, no fairy tale to protect, just herself. And something unexpected happened. Instead of fading away, she grew stronger. She focused deeply on humanitarian causes. She campaigned against landmines. She visited war zones. She continued her work with AIDS patients and the sick. She used her global fame not for luxury, but for impact. The world's love for her did not disappear. It intensified. She was no longer just the people's princess. She was becoming a global symbol of compassion. But fame without protection can be dangerous. And as Diana stepped into her new independent life, dating again, traveling freely, choosing her own path, the media attention became even more aggressive. Photographers chased her constantly. Cars followed her through city streets. Every new relationship became breaking news. Freedom had come, but so had risk. In the summer of 1997, Diana began spending time in the south of France. She looked relaxed, lighter. There were photographs of her smiling in ways that felt genuine again. It seemed, finally, like she might be finding peace. But history sometimes moves quietly before it changes everything. And one late night in Paris, a car would enter a tunnel, and the world would never be the same again. The night the world stood still. In the summer of 1997, something about Diana Spencer felt different. For the first time in many years, she looked lighter. The constant royal pressure was behind her. The painful marriage was over. And although the cameras still followed her everywhere, there were moments, small but real, when her smile seemed truly free. That August, she was in Paris, the city of lights, the city of romance. No one knew that history was quietly moving toward one of its most heartbreaking nights. On the evening of August 30th, Diana left the Ritz Paris with her companion, Dodi Fayed. Outside, photographers were already waiting, flashing cameras, shouting voices, the same intense media pressure that had followed her for years. They entered a car and drove into the Paris night. At first, it was just another fast escape from the cameras, something Diana had experienced many times before. But this time, something went terribly wrong. Shortly after midnight, the car entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. Moments later, disaster struck. The crash was sudden, violent, unforgiving. News began to spread in the early hours of August 31st, 1997. At first, the reports were confused, unclear. People around the world woke up to rumors they did not want to believe. Then the confirmation came. Diana was gone. She was only 36 years old. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Across Britain, silence fell. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds began to gather. People brought flowers, letters, photographs. Many stood quietly, not speaking, as if words were too small for the moment. The grief was global. In London, in Paris, in cities far beyond Europe, millions of people felt the same heavy shock. It was not just the death of a princess. It felt personal, deeply personal, because Diana had never behaved like a distant royal figure. She had touched hands others were afraid to touch. She had knelt to speak to children. She had shown the world that kindness and vulnerability could exist even inside the most formal system. And now she was gone. In the days that followed, the sea of flowers outside the palace grew higher and higher. The world watched as her funeral took place at Westminster Abbey. Millions more stood in silence. Millions more watched through tears. During the service, Earl Spencer spoke words that captured what so many were feeling. He called her the people's princess, and the name stayed forever. Because that was exactly what she had become. Not perfect, not protected, but deeply human. Today, decades later, the story of Diana still lives on. In the way the world talks about compassion. In the way the royal family slowly began to change. In the memories of those who once reached out and felt her hand gently hold theirs. The fairy tale she entered as a shy 19-year-old did not end the way anyone expected, but her impact, her warmth, her quiet emotional courage, those never disappeared. And perhaps the real question was never whether Diana fit into the royal world. Perhaps the real question was this: what if she was never meant to? What if her true role was to change it forever? One princess, one legacy. Before you leave, take a second and think about this. Diana's story was not just about a princess. It was about a young woman who entered a powerful system, felt lost inside it, broke under pressure, and still chose kindness. She showed us that empathy is stronger than status, that vulnerability is not weakness, and that even one gentle heart can shake an entire institution. If her story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe, because this channel is not just about learning English. It's about learning through lives that change the world. Like this video so more people can discover stories that matter. And in the comments, tell me, what is the one lesson you are taking from Diana's life? Because stories are powerful, but the real power begins when we carry their message into our own lives. See you in the next story.